debriefing after a critical incident or after a major incident in our programs. There's a few debriefing touch points that we can talk about. And first of all, just in general, the importance of, I know when we're working such shifts that are so busy and there's so much happening, it can be so hard to find a way to take that time for everyone who's involved in an incident to be together. But it is so important, and it's important for our ability to process, even not just to be like functional as a team in our work roles, but also for us to process what we've gone through as like human people that are also wearing job roles and job hats. So when we're going through a debrief, some things that we can touch on that are helpful. First of all, we can ask ourselves, what made the conversation and or the situation difficult? What was your goal going into the conversation or situation? Looking back, what would you have done differently? And looking back, what would you have done again? And having that opportunity to create that dialogue as a team is so helpful, and it can help us like actually cement that learning process. Also checking in with ourselves when we're back home. Sometimes the things we experience in shelter settings will bring up our own traumas or pain, especially in situations of crisis. So being able to reach out to our support systems and to our site managers or program support if we need additional resources. Ready for the next slide whenever it works. So this is a slide that is part of the protocol that we have in place for the physical distancing shelter and the VMO shelters with the joint office. So I'll share it here in the slide with everyone in case it's mirroring what you all have in place or if it's information that's helpful. So first of all, it's important to include all staff involved in the incident. And anyone who's present for it, anyone who is who's available, who was affected by it, who was a part of that moment. And obviously, sometimes that's just not possible. Sometimes we don't have the capacity for a group of people to meet during a shift and not be covering the floor or covering wherever staffing is needed. So if that's the case, we can all teamwork that and think together what we do. If that means that the shift lead after the conversation goes and checks individually with each person, and checks in with them, asks the same questions, and shares what was said by others. If that's breaking it into two different groups, finding whatever we can do to make sure that everyone does receive that same check-in. And then making space for emotional debriefing and for factual debriefing. So when doing that, we want to discuss the incident, the actions taken, what could have been done differently, what was done well, and any emotional component of the incident as it relates to the staff and participant well-being. I know for me, if I'm in work mode and if it's like go time and we've just dealt with a lot of things and there's been a lot happening, I tend to just have this really like procedural, like, let's get this done, let's check this off, we got to keep moving attitude. And having a moment to reflect on what the emotional impact is of the incident with the team, as long as we feel safe and feel like that's something we can do in that moment. That's something that I'm really working on keeping in mind, and I value as an aspect of debriefing. And then making that plan for further action as needed. Decide who writes the incident report, what type of follow-up needs to happen, and assign roles to who will complete what. If it came to a moment where an exclusion is necessary, make a plan for who will contact the on-call manager or speak with the person who will meet the documenting requirements. Just basic things like that to make sure that we're all on the same page. Ready for the next slide. So to double back a little bit, talking a little bit about emotional debriefing versus factual debriefing. With emotional debriefing, this type of debriefing involves communicating how the incident affected you and your team. And it's, as I touched on a little bit, it's a concrete thing that we can all do together that can help combat that secondary trauma and burnout and vicarious trauma that we experience in our work. Secondary trauma can be triggered by experiencing and helping a client navigate those scary, violent, traumatic situations that are happening. And using emotional debriefing as a tool can give you and your team that opportunity to receive feedback and support from each other. It also makes it easier to leave work at the door and not take as much of that experience home with you. I know for me, there's been nights where like those incidences are just playing over and over in my head, and it's like a loop, and I'm trying to sleep, but I'm like thinking about what I could have done, what I should have done, or it's just it's kind of like a revolving video or whatnot playing. And having that opportunity to actually take a second and have that emotional processing, especially recognizing that other people around me are feeling that way and that we were all affected, and that like sense of togetherness has been really helpful for me in sort of moving on and letting go some of the stress from that incident. And then factual debriefing, just really articulating like what has occurred during your shift in order for things to run smoothly, what needs to happen, like we've talked about. And often this happens at the shift change, making sure that the shift coming on is well prepared and they understand what's going on. And again, touching a little bit on what Jen mentioned, and I think I saw it in the chat as well, making sure that the language we're using when we're engaging in our debriefing is reflective of the values that we hold for our work and for our guests and for our programs. Also, speaking from personal experience, sometimes when I'm really frustrated, my language changes and it's not what I want to show up as. And I might be like using more inflammatory language or more like blame-based language, or using words that are not accurate, but they're really just like, they're what I perceived, what I thought. Like I might be like, yeah, saying things like, I think I saw in the chat, like labeling someone as aggressive and problematic and like really high, really needy in the moment, and using those words that like, if I'm not feeling escalated and if I'm not feeling frustrated or like caught up, I would be like processing through that and saying like, okay, actually, that's not how I think about guests. That's not how I like typically do my work. So if like being intentional about that, the language that we are using, and making sure that if there is something that we're saying, if we felt like someone was aggressive, can we back that up? Do we have a factual, like, what does that word actually mean to us? And instead of saying that guest was aggressive, I might say that guest made a verbal threat, or that guest moved forward with his body in a way that appeared intimidating, or that guest threw something down on the ground, near my foot. Like really being intentional and careful about our language. Those might not have been the greatest examples, but also hoping for anyone else that has some as well. Ready for the next slide. Cool. So that's just a little bit on like the importance and kind of the power of having an opportunity and prioritizing debriefing. I'm wondering for anybody and all of y'all's your experience, what has debriefing been something that's been consistent in your work, or are there ways that you've done this that have been especially helpful or impactful? I see from Rob that stating that it's been a struggle to get everyone on the same page with the importance of debriefing.
Yeah, I wrote it, but I'll just expand a little bit. Yeah, I mean, it's really been inconsistent. There are certain when something has gone down or there's something important, we do get a little more buy-in, but just kind of the everyday, it's really hard to stay in the habit of doing it. And I think I've been guilty of that sometimes too. I just want to get it over with and, get on with my day or evening. But I do think it's really important. And yeah, I think it's something that we're working on, but it's always kind of been a challenge.
Also, just to add for folks that have like transitioned into working at home instead of in a shelter space, it's way easier to just be like, my work day's over, turning off the laptop and not sharing your day with anybody and just going on with, making dinner and all that. And I think there's a lot of debriefing that's not happening for people who are teleworking, like myself, and where we need to create opportunities for each other in that different sort of space to have conversations with people and realize it's just as important, maybe even more so in a way because of the isolation, that debriefing is always healthy, and maybe we need to push ourselves a little more to ask for that opportunity. So that note to myself, I need to ask for that opportunity. Hello, yes.
That's such a good point, especially while we're all sort of like fragmented in our spaces in ways that we didn't used to be. I'm glad you mentioned that.
I think it also adds to the element of like creating an equal workspace for like, especially working in places where there's like a lot of like a pyramid system of like positions and like a hierarchy, especially like bureaucratic settings and stuff. Like it's good for everybody to kind of know what's on the same page as when possible be as like lateral with information sharing as possible, so that everyone can come in kind of knowing what to expect and feeling like involved and feeling like they're participating in their work more. It's also trauma informed as employees to give each other that information, but I think it really adds to like morale and inclusivity and people wanting to work together on the shift when that's happening.
Absolutely. I really like that part about like it can be so hard to find those ways to foster that teamwork, then that like community feeling in a program, and using this as a tool for that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for going through that section.